Hello, good afternoon to our online audience and those who are here. Welcome to the Wilson Center Book Talk event hosted by the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative, which I direct. I am John Thormajuk, and I will be your moderator. The U.S. Congress established the Wilson Center 55 years ago as a living memorial to the 28th president and to be a bridge between the world of academia and the world of public affairs. Since 1968, our nonpartisan mission remains the same. We tackle global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform the public and policy community on pressing issues. One of the pressing issues now is forced displacement, which is now a defining issue of the 21st century. According to UNHCR, there are over 110 million forcibly displaced people from around the world, including at least 35 million refugees, of which 67% are in protracted situations, defined as living in the host country for 5 years or more. At the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative here at the Wilson Center, we strive to expand the space for new perspectives, constructive dialogue, and sustainable solutions. And this brings us to today's discussion, which will put a human face behind these numbers by highlighting lived experience of Tibetan refugees and others who have been displaced from their homeland for several years. In 2008, the Chinese government cracked down on protests throughout Tibet, and Amy Yee, then a journalist for the Financial Times, found herself covering a press conference with the Dalai Lama in his exile home in Dharamsala, India. She never imagined a hug from the spiritual leader would spark a global 14-year journey to spotlight the stories of Tibetans in exile. And so we are delighted to host the author of the book, From the Rooftop of the World, Travels Among Tibetan Refugees on 4 Continents. Welcome, Amy. And so how this will go today, in part 1, I will have a conversation with the author. And then in second part, we have our 2 distinguished experts and discussants who will join us. That's why you don't see them here yet. They are seated in the audience, and they will be here. And then in the third part, we will have questions with the audience. Those who are online can submit their questions in advance, and those who are here, we will let you know when the time comes. And so let me start with Amy, and then we'll have a conversation. Amy is an award-winning journalist, and you have the bio there. But I just want to mention a few things. She has written for the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the National Public Radio, and more than 30 media outlets. She has won 3 awards from the United Nations Correspondents Association, 4 from South Asian Journalists Association, in first place from the Association of Healthcare Journalists for her analysis about reducing deaths of children in India and Bangladesh. In 2023, she won the Asian American Journalists Association's award for political reporting about protecting voting rights and voting rights of immigrant voters. And he also won an award, the Society of Professional Journalists, for racial equity reporting. Amy has had 4 notable essays in the Best American Essays. She has reported from more than 20 countries, including 10 from Africa. He is a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School, Columbia Journalism School, Wellesley, and Hunter's FA program. Welcome, Amy. And let's start from the book cover. The book is called From the Rooftop of the World. That's the title of the book. And for those who may not be familiar with what that is, I just want to warm up, and let Amy start with that, and then we'll go deep into the discussion. Welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan, everyone at the Wilson Center. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you, and also with our two incredible discussants who will join us. The title, Tibet is often known as the rooftop of the world because it's so high, it's a very high elevation. And originally the title was the title of a separate essay I wrote about the largest Tibetan settlement, which is not in the north of India in the Himalayas. It's actually in southern India, in Karnataka. It's 5 hours south of Bangalore. So that was, I thought, far from the rooftop of the world. I mean, originally that place is like, it was jungle with elephants. I mean, it's a completely different environment than the Tibetan plateau. But then I went even further, and 3 chapters in the book are in Australia, and that is really far from the rooftop of the world. And the biggest Tibetan settlement in Australia is in Sydney on a beach town. So completely different environment and setting. So that just shows you the trajectory of people's lives and where they ended up in the world.
Yeah. You follow Tibetans in India, in 4 continents, and what inspired you to write this book? What were the circumstances that led to the writing of this important book?
So in March 2008, I was a reporter for the Financial Times, the British newspaper, and I was based in New Delhi, as many of you know, because we were friends there. And March 2008, there were big protests in Tibet that turned violent. And so it was really big news. It was the biggest violent unrest in Greater China since Tiananmen Square in 1989. So all the journalists were sent up to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama lives in exile in India since 1959. And I was actually in Bangalore the day before, and then I was told to get up to Dharamsala by my editor, which, these things happen. So I had a really quick turnaround, and involving a 4 a.m. propeller jet flight and then a 5 hour journey up the hills in a Jeep. And so I was late to this press conference. And so I was literally running to this press conference in the Dalai Lama's residence. And then when I got there were no seats left. So I sat on the floor in the front, and His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, could see me very clearly when I asked a question. And then right after the press conference ended, which was 2 hours of talking about a really violent crackdown by the Chinese government against Tibetans, the Dalai Lama saw me, and his face lit up, and he made a beeline towards me, and he said, "Chinese?" And I am ethnically Chinese, but I'm American. I was born in the U.S., and I grew up here. But I'm ethnically Chinese. My parents are from Hong Kong. So I didn't know what to say at first, and I said, well, I'm American, but he was really excited to see someone ethnically Chinese at the press conference. And then he came over to me, and then he grabbed my cheeks like this and was squeezing them and said, it's between China and Tibet, and we must discuss, and you must tell them. And then he grabbed me in a bear hug and just hugged me for a long while. And photographers from Reuters, Associated Press, they were all there at this press conference, and so that photo went out around the world, which is completely unexpected, because as a reporter, you're not in the story usually like that. But my friend who was in Concord, New Hampshire, was reading the Concord Monitor, and he was flipping through the newspaper the next day, and then emailed me and said, Amy, did the Dalai Lama hug you? Because I'm looking at a photo in New Hampshire of you. So, I mean, that just starts to introduce some of what was going on and some of the themes of the book as well. But so people have said to me, so the Dalai Lama told you to write the book and you wrote the book, and that's not why I wrote the book. I mean, I'm sure he just meant like write your articles. But in the days that I spent in Dharamsala at that time, I was just really amazed by what I saw there. Dharamsala is the seat of the Tibetan exile government. It's where the Dalai Lama lives, but about more than 10,000 Tibetans living there. So it's like a microcosm of Tibet in India. And I didn't quite realize that, even though I have been in Tibet as a backpacker like a decade before. But when you go up to Dharamsala, it's like a Tibetan town. So, and in the week I was there, people were out marching peacefully, demonstrating, candlelight vigils, in response to what was happening in Tibet. So they were carrying, banners, they were carrying the Tibetan flag, portraits of the Dalai Lama, and all those things can get you arrested in Tibet, or worse. And that's what we are seeing on the other side in Tibet, in this parallel universe where people had come out to demonstrate, and then it resulted in violence that ended up, people getting shot and killed. So it was just a really, eye-opening experience to be there. And then I was really fascinated with Tibetans and how they preserve their identity in exile, cultural identity, their religious identity, however you want to define it. But it was really on full display in Dharamsala. And, I met Tibetans who were born in India in exile and had never been to Tibet, but they were very Tibetan. And so there are reasons why that cultural identity is so well preserved and expressed. So all those things were really fascinating to me. And as someone who's Asian American, I've always been really aware of and interested in identity and moving between worlds, people who balance different sides of their identity, people who navigate, different identities and worlds. So, these days we have terms like, code switching or intersectional and these kinds of terms, which are helpful to understand that a lot of people feel this, like these different sides of their identity and their being.
That set the stage for this great book. And Peter Hessler of the New Yorker, in his review, quote this book as beautifully written with engaging characters who are never lost in the shadow of Chinese politics. Amy Yee has done a wonderful job of capturing the details, dramas, and dignities of Tibetan life in exile. And in your book, you follow three main people, Tibetans, for years. Why did they leave Tibet? What happened to them? What did you find out about them that you didn't know about Tibetans?
Well, there are three main people, and they come in and out of the narrative. And the first person we meet is, in the book, his name is Topten, and he is a monk and has been a monk since he was 12 or 13, a young child. And in the first chapter, we're at a basketball game in Dharamsala because he loves basketball. He's a huge basketball fan, and we had to go see this basketball game. And and then another person is Norbu, and he was a chef in a restaurant I went to a lot, and he. The reason he left is when he was a teenager. He was maybe 14 or 15. He was a bystander near a demonstration in 1988 in Lhasa, and he got swept up in the police sweep afterwards. And I don't think he was involved with the demonstrations, but he was in prison for 3 months, and he was beaten and interrogated. And when they released him, he tried to go to school. And he was blacklisted and couldn't attend school. Even when he tried to, find work, find a job, authorities came and said he had to stop. So again, he was blocked from living a life. And then his brother suggested to him to go to India because he said, "You don't have any opportunities here." So Norbu will come up later because we meet him again in 2015 in Australia. But then the third person, it's actually a couple. Their names are Deki and Dondup, and they fled in the winter of March 2008 as a direct result of the protests earlier in the year. They had helped a friend photocopy some flyers, and the flyers might have said something like human rights, and that's it. And then their friend got arrested. And then as soon as they found out their friend was arrested, they decided to leave because they felt like they would very likely be next. So they quickly fled, and I had asked, was it hard to leave? Because they had really carved out a middle-class life, which was not easy, especially for them. Like they come from, ordinary backgrounds. Deki's father was a construction worker, and they had good jobs. They had a nice house. But Deki said that their fear was so great, their decision was instant, and they didn't say goodbye to their family or anybody because they didn't want to tell anyone their plans. They didn't want to get them in trouble. So...
1988, 1987, that's when I left my home country of South Sudan as an accompanied child. And I relate to their plight because what often people don't see is they react to the physical symptom of refugee crossing the border to their territories, but often don't really get the context as to why they leave. And the event you just described that prompts you to write this book here set the stage, and human rights issues, and people are being just targeted, no freedom. Which is why the Boston Globe described the book as readers who seek to understand the plight of our fellow humans in other parts of the world should hang on every word of this book. And again, you can relate to any of it when you read it. And Amy, people often, have different perceptions. So when they see you, like what the spiritual leader did, they thought you were a Chinese. So how did your own identity shape your experience when meeting Tibetan in exile? What was their reaction to someone? Someone they see like you, who is Chinese American, ethnically Chinese. What?
Yeah, I think some people, like there's a German woman I meet in the beginning who said to me, she's in Dharamsala, and she said, "You must have a hard time here," meaning Tibetans must be hostile towards me. And I said, actually, they're really warm and welcoming. And that was the case with Tibetans I met, everywhere, India and Australia. People were really welcoming to me and open and warm, which might seem counterintuitive. And it's something I asked Tibetans all the time. And in the first chapter, I'm watching the basketball game with Topton, and I just said, you don't hate Chinese people, or you're not afraid of me? And he's like, no, I'm not afraid of you, and we don't hate Chinese people. I don't like the Chinese government. So being able to distinguish between just a person and the actions of a government, I think that's really remarkable. And that, was echoed often when I asked Tibetans about that. I even asked a former political prisoner who I just unexpectedly met. I saw him on the street in Sydney in Australia when I was there, and so we were so surprised to see each other. And so I even said to him at some point, you don't dislike Chinese people, or you're not afraid of them? He's like, no, I don't have any, don't dislike Chinese people. In fact, when I was in prison, I was friends with Chinese people who were also in prison. So it was just a different way to think about this relationship. And for sure, the message from the Dalai Lama, he, as you could tell from that, his outreach to me, literally when I met him at the press conference, he strongly encourages good relationships between Chinese people and Tibetans. And even one of the chapters of the book it's part of a quote from him, where he said, my faith in the Chinese government is getting thinner and thinner, but I still have faith in Chinese people. And he actually said that in the press conference in 2008, where tensions were really high, you saw violence happening, and he still said that. I just think that, that ability to distinguish between a government and ordinary people is really remarkable.
And it is very, very important, which is why a book like this that has put the human face behind all these labels, behind the numbers, is very important, because people can relate to this, and then the flawed assumptions would just be not there anymore when a person to person have that connection. How are the Tibetan diaspora keeping their culture? You speak about the identity. How are they doing that? How are they keeping their culture alive? And then what can we learn from them, from what you wrote in the book here?
One of the key ways Tibetans are keeping their culture alive in exile is through a very strong and established Tibetan education system in India. So Chapter 4 actually focuses on education, and there is a flagship Tibetan school in Dharamsala called Tibetan Children's Village, and about 2,000 students were attending at that time, and there are about 80 different kinds of schools and institutions across India for Tibetans. Now the curriculum is in Tibetan language, so Tibetans are learning it and immersed in it from the start. They're learning history, culture, religion, the traditions, dance, music in those schools. And then when I visited the Tibetan community in Australia, they don't have that system, but they have weekend schools for children to learn the language and music and dance and so on. So you do have those, offshoots even though they're not in India. And I think it's quite remarkable that India, I'm not sure if there are any other countries that allow this. If there are, please let me know. But a Tibetan education system in Tibetan, it still follows the Indian curriculum, because Tibetan students will sit for the same exams to enter university as Indians. So
But it's in Tibetan
yes, it's
language.
in Tibetan. Yeah. So we might be able to hear more about this from Khalden. So, I think that is really central, and it was definitely the Dalai Lama's vision from the start. So I got to see an audience with him. He was giving an audience to Tibetans who had just arrived from Tibet, and he does this with every Tibetan who arrives from Tibet. And actually, he was exhorting them to study, and he said education is the most important thing. And it might seem surprising, that his focus was really about studying, but it was, he sees this as the key to the future. And so when he came to India in exile, one of the first things that he wanted was a school for Tibetan children. I mean, it was before the monasteries and everything. That was the priority, was education. So that's one way.
As someone who also has lived in the refugee camp, I cannot emphasize enough the role education play, because for me it was the only asset that I got out of those 13 years in the camps, along with my faith that sustained me during these adversities. And every refugee is different. You relate to different contexts, but again, there are basic commonality. And so, and again, it is very impressive how the India has hosted and create this space for the Tibetans. I was in Kenya. Kenya has a confinement refugee policy, so we were confined to the refugee camp. Although the curriculum was in English, which is not our mother tongue, the Kenyan also had their national language, Kiswahili. And when it was introduced, it was very difficult at the level we were in, but we could not learn with our mother tongue in the national school. And so this is impressive in India for Tibetans. So for our online audience, please, if you have questions, start submitting them. I will have Amy take some break here in reading, not me asking a question, but if you have some paragraph you want to read, and then our part 2 will be underway. We'll join by Kalden and Sophia to come on the stage here. So what would you like to read?
Yeah, I think I'll read this passage about Deki. She's the woman who fled Tibet in the winter of 2008 with her husband, and they left everything. So, as I mentioned, they had worked their way up to get, good office jobs, which is not easy, for an ordinary Tibetan. So, here's what she said. Deki said, "We spent our whole life in Tibet under Chinese control. We had worked so hard to get jobs in an office where we could work like Chinese people. We got all these opportunities, and then we lost them all." Deki's loss was literal, too. In Nepal, so they crossed over into Nepal from Tibet. In Nepal, she lost the baby that had been growing inside of her for nearly 2 months, conceived in Tibet but lost during their escape. Later, she shared with me a letter she wrote in Chinese that recounted their flight from Tibet. It described emotions Deki didn't articulate when we talked in person. She said, "We lost our first family member during our escape. We had given him or her so much hope. We had hoped that in the future, even if we ended up in a place where we had no other family, we would not end up being alone, even if one of us should die. We had thought that we would try our best to raise the child to be a useful talent for Tibet. But in the blink of an eye, everything fell apart." And then I'll just skip to the end of this chapter where I asked her, what they had done was they photocopied these flyers. And I asked her if they regretted it, to lose everything for doing that. And so was their loss, all for 50 sheets of paper, worth it? I remembered asking the same question of a Tibetan man imprisoned in a Chinese jail for 7 months. After the prison guards beat him, they left him naked in the cold, so pain seeped deep into his body. His crime, making photocopies of the Tibetan flag. He still suffered health problems, and though he had escaped to India, he could not earn a living. Did he regret making those photocopies? I asked him quietly. Tears slid down his face, and he wiped them away with the flat of his hand. He nodded. Deki and Dundup lost so much, their home, their jobs, relatives, and the beginnings of a baby. Without hesitation, though, both she and Dundup shook their heads at my question about regret. She said, "Even though we had to leave Tibet, we don't regret making the photocopies," Deki replied firmly. "We did something right, something good for Tibet."
Would you like to say a few words about what you just read? Contextualize it a bit. And Joshua or Kate, start bringing the seat so that the two panelists can
Yeah. I just think, she was so firm in saying, no, we don't regret that at all. We did something right for Tibet. It shows you their resolution and their resolve. And I was even a little surprised that her husband said he didn't regret it because he, really seemed to miss things he had left behind. But they were both very firm about that. And it just shows you how much people risk for something that seems so small, photocopying the Tibetan flag or, something that says human rights. And, I'm not sure what happened to the person who was arrested, not sure what happened to him. So anyway, it's just showing some of their resolve and their strength.
While waiting for the other two speakers to come on board, when I look at the picture that where the spiritual leader has just hugged you, as a person who was at that moment, what was going on in your mind?
Yeah, I wish I could show you the photo.
Yeah.
I managed to find it. I hadn't seen it for a long time, and so I had to ask my friend at Reuters to get the photo for me recently. So I didn't even have it on hand, and so I looked at it again recently. I was just surprised. I mean, it's very different if you're Tibetan and that happens to you. I think it must be very emotionally overwhelming, and Tibetans who have an audience with His Holiness, they feel like very emotionally overwhelmed and in a daze. But to me, I mean, it's definitely, very memorable, but it would be like, I don't know, if Obama hugs you at a press conference, you're kind of surprised, but I was on deadline, it was a very busy week. I was like, okay, I need to go. No, I didn't say that. No, I didn't. It was,
Yes.
I remember, it was, very memorable, but that was just the start of my arrival there. I had so much to do, and it was literally running around the town trying to interview people. So then when I mentioned to Tibetans, they were like, what? Wow,
Yeah.
But I don't, a Tibetan person would have a different response.
Yeah,
I think.
exactly.
But,
I mean, just like me, if my bishop hugged me, it's a different religiously in terms of, but yeah, it's quite a thing.
I'll just say,
okay.
he was, the other thing I do remember, his arm is bare because he's wearing robes, and he was very, warm to the touch. Like, physically, his temperature was, hot or warm. And I remember, because he was, really embracing me, and he's, literally warm. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now we're going to invite our two next speakers to come on the stage, Calden Lodore and Dr. Sophie Richardson. Please join us on the stage. And let me start quickly introducing them in order of their presentation. And then after each of them makes remark, we will have, again, the conversation among ourselves. So to the far left of me is Calden Lodore, who is the Tibetan Service Director at Radio Free Asia. He has more than 27 years of journalistic experience, and I would say he is a Tibetan American. He's a former Tibetan refugee, so he's bringing that lived experience perspectives to the. Prior to his journalism career, and this is very interesting, that he was a Tibetan monk in Dharamsala, India. He has lived and studied in various countries throughout his life. So he's going to bring that deep personal experience. And then next, after him would be Dr. Sophia Richardson, who served as the China Director at Human Rights Watch until recently. She is an expert in China and human rights, and she has testified in Canadian Parliament, European Parliament, the U.S. Senate, and House of Representatives. She is the author of China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. She speaks Mandarin, and she has done rare interviews with Chinese policymakers. She has a PhD from the University of Virginia and a BA from Auburn College. So let me start with you, Calden. Overall, as a Tibetan American with lived experience, what is your take of the book?
Hello, thank you for having me here. Hello, and online folks, hello. Amazing, I should say. First of all, I want to be a good Buddhist. When listening to Amy about His Holiness's hug, should I be jealous or should I not be jealous? But really, this book is a living memorial. We all raised up in that way, so I can actually relate very easily. But more importantly, she sends out a message to the world that people can be persecuted, but people's mind and spiritual strength will never be destroyed. So that's what I could summary from her book.
This is really excellent.
You
mind.
need short answers. So.
Yes, and again, I just want to emphasize on that too, from the book review, to put that. Ha Jin, the National Book Award winner, Amy describes displaced Tibetan intimately and truthfully. Their displacement cannot crush their humanity. Instead, their losses have strengthened them. What you just said about, the spiritual strength, and now, Sophie, I want to come back to you, and then before I ask to give your impression of the book to us, an expert, human rights activist, what is your overall take?
Well, the first thing I want to do is thank you for inviting me to be here this afternoon. And the second, and probably more important, thanks goes to Amy for writing an incredible book that I think accomplishes all that Kalden has just set out, but also, having worked in a world where not just the facts of people's experiences, but their feelings, their perceptions, their emotions are so hard to know, to get at those stories and then to tell them so well that you feel almost as if the people you write about in the book are sitting there with you is a real feat. And I have to laugh a little bit at your very journalistic impulse just now to put, a deadline on par with His Holiness. But I also think that, to write in such depth over such a period of time and give us such a sense of these people's experiences with a sense of compassion is a remarkable accomplishment. So thank you for spending so much time telling us about these people. It's a real gift.
Well put.
Thank you. I didn't know what you both would say, so it's nice to hear that.
So let me get back to you, Kalden. Now we are going deeper into the things. Amy described one of the people she saw during that protest. A youth was wearing a T-shirt, and the T-shirt has this quote: "Justice has been raped in Tibet." That is a quote that you can just think about. And as a Tibetan American who has lived there, what is the context, and how can you help us understand this?
I think that will have so many different connotation and interpretation, but I think this particular situation, it refers to Tibetan people inside being totally deprived of their basic rights, as Amy has well said, that if we as main media organization covering Tibet, oftentimes, I've been on this job for 27 years, and I don't know how many times have we reported people ending up in prison, long sentences, simply carrying a picture of His Holiness, or later nowadays having some sort of quotation of His Holiness as their mobile devices, or nowadays even worse is talking to your loved ones in exile. So the situation is getting worse. At that moment in 2008, in March, every year in March, it's considered a sensitive period, because in March 1959 there was uprising, His Holiness fled, followed by some 80 to 100,000 Tibetans into exile. So Tibetan people remembers this outside as well as inside, and China would try to clamp those down. And the spark of those small protests became a huge, not only what is called the Tibet Autonomous Region, but throughout the Tibetan areas were incorporated into Chinese provinces. So people really got fed up with the Chinese policy and clamped down. A lot of people killed, but now you see, I tell you where the justice is not served here, why Tibetan justice is served. We have reported since 2008 until about 2016, 156 Tibetans inside Tibet have self-immolated. 156. protest against Chinese policy towards Tibetans. But now experts are saying, why don't they go into big China's city and blow themselves up, cause maximum damage? No one has done that. Now this, I recall back in 2008, that same press conference, Holiness was so frustrated, so worried. He said he couldn't sleep well last night when hearing all these reports what's happening in Tibet. But then he said, if the Tibetan struggle turns violent, I will cease to be the leader of the struggle. That's the influence there. So at the one hand, Tibetan wants justice, but peaceful. So their justice, no matter what, their voice is not being heard by the policymakers. So therefore, justice is being wrapped, the basic human rights are not being respected. It's violated totally.
And so if you can comment on that before I ask you the next question, that since the 1950s, that the Tibetan refugee plight and the question about justice, as Calden just mentioned, why is justice not being served for these people, from the policy perspective and China with the U.S. policy? Comment on that.
Well, maybe it's important to note that as a general rule, people across China are deprived of some of the most fundamental rights, including the right to a fair trial. But I think in Tibetan areas, the problems are uniquely deeper, as they can be in other parts of the mainland, for example, for human rights defenders. But one of the cases that I sort of carry with me, or that I always remember, is a man named Chacho Rinpoche, who is the leader of the Tasha Lempo monastery, who was arrested in 1995. And it was 2 years before anybody even knew what he was being charged with separatism, and I think endangering state secrets. I'd have to double check on that. Anyway,
Yes.
He was finally given, in 1997, he was given a 6-year sentence. And after another year or two, there was literally no more information available about him. This is 25 years ago. I mean, he's assumed to have died in detention. So I bring this case up because I think it's such a horrifying example of someone who was prosecuted in the formal legal system, who had, no access to the evidence presented against him. He wouldn't have had access to the lawyer of his choice. And he literally vanished into the black hole of the judicial system, the formal judicial system in that region. And so that's not even getting into what happens to people who are prosecuted or persecuted outside the formal legal system. And I think that's sort of a powerful example. And you can see the echoes of that particular case, not just against that community, but all of those human rights, those pathologies of human rights violations that echo down even into recent cases where people are literally taken off the grid.
Jonathan, if I can, if I
Yeah,
might
go ahead.
add a little bit, the Sophie's example of Chadar Rinpoche is an amazing example here. In concurrence with that, the little boy Panchen Lama was recognized by the Dalai Lama, who's a very high-ranking Tibetan Lama. He's vanished as well around the same time because Chadar Rinpoche was then the leader of the search party for the reincarnation of Panchen Lama. And his whereabout, he and his entire family's whereabout, until today, since 1995, it's not known to the world. Yeah.
But if I can just add a quick point, let's be clear, we're not just talking about abuses of people in monastic communities, or an organized entity that the Chinese state sees as threatening or problematic. Let's think about somebody like Tashi Longchuk.
Yes.
This is a man who merely had the temerity to suggest that Tibetans should be able to act on the right to have their children educated in the Tibetan language, in their mother tongue. Which at least on paper is a guaranteed right inside China and under international law. And he did a 5-year sentence and then was released and then quite recently
had incidents. And just today we reported this morning that the same guy, because once you are a political prisoner, then you are deprived of lots of rights. what they call is the political rights, but it's also a survival right, really. So what he did is he set up a car washing facility.
That's right. I was trying to register a
Yeah,
business.
and then that happened on October 17th, and the authorities came, destroyed his facilities, beaten and detained for 3 years. No justice whatsoever. So probably that's what the raping of justice is, what Amy was referring to.
And in this book on page 59, where Amy described how the 2008 march, pro-Tibet march turned deadly when the Chinese force opened arms and shot civilians, killing at least 100 Tibetans and 13 Chinese. And then someone took that picture of the dead bodies and shared it with the outside world. And as Amy reported, when Chinese authorities realized the image had been disseminated far and wide, soldiers came to take the bodies away in an effort to erase the evidence. I mean, that the mindset of the Chinese government, is that still that they they think that the outside world is not really aware of what is going on? What is your comment on that?
What is the driving idea there? I think it is to literally destroy or erase the evidence of human rights violations. But I think it's a larger problem. I think it's very clear that the Chinese government is now effectively trying to erase not just the distinct Tibetan identity, but multiple different identities of communities across the country. And I think that's very clear in the policies around not just religion, but language, and efforts to force people to engage in what the authorities refer to as sinicization, which is to lead an existence that comports with what the authorities see as the traditional, the politically, socially, culturally acceptable identity. And so it's not just about what happens in moments, I think, of protest and state brutality. The suite of policies that have been inflicted on the region over the last couple of decades are clearly designed to eradicate this distinct identity, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as a journalist, also being a Tibetan, I have this question that raised all the time in my mind, and unlikely we cannot ask the Chinese authority there. But the thing is, after 70 years of Chinese occupation of Tibet, if you see any Chinese documents referring to Tibet, they would say Tibet is inalienably part of China from forever time. They don't say this to Hong Kong. They don't say this to other minority. Why they keep insisting on that? Like Tibet has to be. And then they, in the bilateral relations, they would insist that the governments and the parliamentarians should say Tibet is part of China. If Tibet had always been part of China, then why would they say this? This is a big question as to why. That's related to your question. Like Tibet, China wanted to present a perfect picture of Tibet, which is not in reality. So whenever these things happen, it's a huge, I think, embarrassment for the policymakers, the leaders of the party, because then it shows a failure.
Amy, let's come back to you because, Sophia mentioned it's erasing multiple identities. And despite that, Tibetans are keeping their culture alive, their identities alive in exile. And your book is about that, preserving that cultural identity and comment on those, multiple identities and the attempt to erase them.
Yeah, in exile, culture, Tibetan culture and identity can flourish in a way it really can't in Tibet. So that's why you see people like Topten, who was a monk, who decided to go he and his cousin decided to go to India where they could study Tibetan Buddhism more freely. And so, actually you'll see that some of the old traditional monasteries in Tibet. They have they have built monasteries in India and southern India, and they have more monks there than in Tibet. I mean, what, I don't know, sobering fact, but on the other hand, kind of incredible that, these monasteries in southern India, where I mentioned before, they might have 2,000 monks, and like the place where I saw it's called Bailakupi. It's just, I was so amazed when I saw this. It's a town, and it looks like Iowa or something because they grow corn there, which I don't think Tibetans eat corn in Tibet. So a Swiss agricultural advisor had said this is the right climate for corn. And then the Tibetan settlers there in the 60s were like, why do we have to clear the land? We're going back to Tibet. And they were, the environment was so different with elephants in the jungle and everything. But to see it decades later, now this established, town with corn growing, these huge, beautiful monasteries. One of my first sights when I entered Bailakupi was of a monk on a tractor in a cornfield with a trucker's hat. It's just like, wow, you really literally transplanted that culture and, a new transplant of this crop. So it said so much in that image. And there's an image that I have of one of the monasteries, but in the background there's a windmill. And, it seemed like something out of, again, like Iowa or someplace like that. But just being able to transplant those cultures wherever you are, and it took a lot of work, and it was a lot of hardship involved, but to see it decades later flourishing like that was really incredible. And then getting to see some of that in Australia as well was amazing. And as I mentioned, they have the weekend schools for children, but I got to see a New Year celebration in Melbourne, in Australia. So Losar is the big Tibetan New Year, and the year of 2009, I was living in Dharamsala, and it was canceled because of the turmoil and the repression in Tibet. Tibetans in exile just didn't want to celebrate as a show of support for people within Tibet. So it was a celebration that's usually like a week long or more. It was completely quiet. And then in Melbourne in 2015, I saw the New Year celebration at like a community hall in Melbourne. And I couldn't find it at first. I was getting lost. And then in the distance, I saw the prayer flags over the doorway. And I said, okay, that's the place to go. So it was a party. Like it was like an incredible party. And people, were making momo dumplings. And there was like a train, so food is also, connective tissue and keeps, the culture alive. People were making the momos. People were, doing traditional Tibetan circle dance. But then they were also, there was a stage, and there was one guy who was rapping in Tibetan. So it was like, new, cultures being blended. And at one point, the MC on the stage picked up the mic and he said, "It's time to disco." And people were up and dancing, and people were in their traditional costumes and attire as well. That's another way of keeping it alive. I mean, people were dressed in chubas and pangden, but they were dancing. And then at one point, Gangnam Style, the song came on, and people were in their traditional attire just doing the Gangnam Style dance, which is like a horse riding thing. And it occurred to me, and I say in the book, I was like, I think some of the Tibetans really did ride horses across the Tibetan grasslands, and now they're doing Gangnam Style, this New Year celebration in Melbourne. So, Losar was very much alive that year. Yeah.
Jonathan, if I may add something here, it's very, when you talk about Gangnam Style, that's in the year 2000, I remember back in New York in the 90s, it was traditional dress and macaroni dance, So here I think it's important to remind our audience is that in the late 80s, 1979 is when China started opening up soon after Mao's death, And there were some hopeful liberal Chinese leaders such as Hu Yaobang and before Deng Xiaoping actually came into power. There was a period where the previous Panchen Lama, who was also released after 9 years in confinement, solitary confinement, then the central government, Chinese central government, was also pushing revival of not only the Tibetans, but everyone who's persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. So there was a period of time, late 80s and early 90s, where Tibetan culture, language, schools, monasteries all started rebuilding in Tibet. There was a hopeful period. Now it's not the case. Just let me give you an example. We did a story last week. Starting from 2025, almost in all areas in Tibetan areas in Tibet, in China now, into Chinese provinces. Right now, the medium of education is in Chinese. Tibetan language is being taught in Tibet. Come 2025, even the Tibetan language education will be banned. So try to imagine. And on top of that, since about 8-9 years ago, no little monks, no little boys or girls can enter into monasteries or nunneries. See, I was a monk. I became a monk when I was 10. So the parents are disallowed by the central Chinese government that kids under the age of 18 cannot go into the monastery. I tell you why it is important. As Jonathan introduced me, I'm a monk turned journalist. But I have had my education in the monastery. So I'm equipped with Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, spiritual, Buddhist philosophy, in addition to other education that I have had in my life. So monasteries in Tibet, monasteries as well as nunneries, as Amy Yee just mentioned about the big monastery in South India. For centuries, this monastery existed in Tibet as a center of learnings. The greatest scholars in Tibet until now all came from these big monasteries. This will die down. So the next generation of Tibetans will see less oriented with the Tibetan, traditional Tibetan culture and the language. Not only that, now language. See, if you are not taught Tibetan language, now there are reports going on that more than 1 million Tibetan kids are being forced to go to what they call is colonial boarding schools, where no Tibetan education whatsoever are being introduced to. So the thinking into this line, the situation is really, really drastic in terms of survival of the Tibetan identity as well as Tibetan people.
And that is, and I guess when His Holiness talked about this in a book when he accused China of cultural genocide, that's one aspect of it. Trying to erase people's identity, their beliefs, and etc. But he also urged all sides to cool down on the rising tension. He did not advocate for complete independence of Tibet despite all of this. I wonder if the three of you can comment too, what the perspective of the Tibetan in exile or about the view of the Lama in terms of what he just said about that.
The Dalai Lama espouses what he calls the middle way, and so not independence from China, but some real autonomy under China, so retaining language, religion, culture, but he does not advocate for independence. And that's also the stance of the exile government. And as to what Tibetan people believe, well, let's hear more from Calvin, but I think most Tibetans will go with what the Dalai Lama advises. And I mean, there are many reasons for this, but I mean, practically speaking, and I was just did a talk with the former prime minister of the exile government, Lobsang Sangay, and he said, there are 3 million military in China. There's 6 million Tibetans. Practically speaking, what's the option in terms of taking up arms? Is that realistic? So perhaps people might long for independence, but practically speaking, it may not be realistic anytime soon. So I don't know, Kalden, what do you think?
You first.
All right. I think it's interesting. Tibetans, when they first arrived in India in 1959, including His Holiness, probably never thought that they will end up being exiled for more than 64 years. Everyone would hope they would go back. But then soon after, putting everything into perspective, geopolitical importance of Tibet, and the relationship between China and other countries, it soon became quite obvious that China is not going to leave Tibet anytime soon. His Holiness says moral authority over Tibetan and also being the free spokesperson for the 6 million Tibetans is unmatchable. This is blessing as well as scary too. What will happen when one day Dalai Lama is no longer there to serve these two purposes? So I think His Holiness, at the very beginning in 1960, convened a meeting of well-known Tibetans and insisted that Tibetan society, even in exile, should democratize. So today, after 64 years, it's very interesting whether we call it Central Tibetan Administration or, most popularly known as the Tibetan Government in Exile. It's a truly amazingly democratically elected system of government. They have, Amy was referring to Sikyong, who is who's like a president, elected by Tibetan diaspora, Tibetans in diaspora all over the world, more than 34 countries. And they have the legislature, which has 45 members of parliament. So His Holiness' vision was that even he no longer in this world, the institution will remain and continue the nonviolent struggle. But as I said, at the very difficult time in 2008, he did say that if the situation turns violent, then he will cease to be the leader of not only the struggle movement, but also being the free spokesperson for the Tibetan people. So that sends a strong message. His conviction is that world peace in the greater picture, but the peace must be achieved through dialogue. Based on that principle, he started reaching out to the Chinese government back in the late 70s. His brother was the emissary and met with Deng Xiaoping. During a course of conversation between the two, Deng Xiaoping apparently have said, accept independence, full independence, anything is possible to talk. So since then, the Dalai Lama's position has been very steadfast in maintaining that middle way ground. Okay, give us the authority, autonomous to preserve our language, culture, religion, even environment, and we will remain under the Constitution. This is a very important word because under the Chinese Constitution, it guarantees the right for self-determination, to practice, the minorities' language, culture, religious faith, etc. So this is the policy where it is. Of course, in any kind of struggle, there are differences in opinions. Many youth leaders nowadays pursue for total independence, but then realistically, ways where it will come as the result, it's very difficult to say. On the other hand, for over the last 30 years during the middle way approach, there hasn't been a tangible result in terms of resolving the Tibet issue. But the argument goes from the other side, like because of this middle way approach, thousands of Tibetans were allowed to come to exile. Thousands of Tibetans were allowed to go back and visit their families and relatives inside Tibet. So now the situations where, particularly when Xi Jinping came into power, huge change in policy, so unpredictable as to what will happen.
Before I let you go, Sophie, I want to thank our online audience. We're going to be open up for questions soon, and our seated audience. And of course, don't forget there are books out there to grab by, and Amy will sign, of course. So thank you for staying tuned. We'll just get back to you quickly. Sophie, before you respond to that question, I think you can also add to this issue, because Amy talked about how she met a Chinese activist and someone also who has a different assumption about the Tibetan people, how she was told, but then when she talks with her and with the real people, she changed her mind about the Tibetan. How do we handle this in the mind of people between the Chinese government, separate the Chinese government and the Chinese people? Because that's where that's where we need to do a lot of work.
A lot of work. I think I've probably spent at least 25% of my career so far encouraging people to be precise in their language and to not use the term China when what they mean is the Chinese government or what they mean is the Chinese Communist Party.
Or saying the Chinese.
Or saying the Chinese.
Even I modified my language.
All 1.4 billion of them, right? Because I think, and I think it's important on a number of different levels. One is to encourage people to be sensitive to who exactly they're talking to and respectful of their perspectives. To recall that the Chinese government is not an elected one. And if I could add to the previous question, I think the point that I would just add to it is not just that the exile community has made a remarkable attempt at pursuing the habits and structures of democracy, but that people can vote from all over the world, yes. Tibetans, which I think is remarkable and extremely unusual, and I think says a lot about how people want to try to have these kinds of debates about whether to call for independence, whether to pursue the middle way, whether to pursue something else, that it's channeled through a democratic structure. But I think the terms also matter because the Chinese government itself wants you to believe that China, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese are all the same thing, and that it is the sole arbiter and spokesperson of all of those different categories of people. And I think at a time when, and Amy, I'm especially glad that towards the end of the book you start talking about these horrific waves of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism that we've seen all over the world and here in the US, that it's all the more important to find ways of combating stereotypes and not conflating identities and having people explain their own how they identify themselves. And I think it's a good lesson for all of us to be reminded to not make those kinds of assumptions.
Yeah.
Jonathan, can I share a story?
If you could, Joshua, are there online questions in advance? Okay. While you are doing that, go ahead.
Back in 2009, this is referring to Amy's experience of are you afraid? You comfortable being, ethnically Chinese, talking to Tibetans. In 2009, I was assigned to cover the 50th anniversary of His Holiness and Tibetans fleeing in exile. So I took a train from Delhi to Pathankot, the junction there. And, I was coming out of my compartment, and the Tibetan lady said, "Are you Mr. Lee?" And I said, "No, I'm Mr. Bruce." Bruce Lee. So, and it's just like, oh, then I spoke to her in Tibetan. "Oh, I'm a Tibetan, you're looking for somebody." So she was apparently a representative of Central Tibetan government, the Tibetan exile, and she was there to receive the Chinese democratic activist who is coming to an event to be held on March 10th. So, I didn't have a car. He had all this reception. So, they gave me a ride. It's about 2-3 hours ride. So we're talking a lot of things. He's from United States as well, and, learning from each other. And then as I was explaining to him, like, where the Tibetans are, how the Dharamsala was started, etc. And towards the end, he asked me, is it personally safe for him to say I'm Chinese? And then I like to tease people. I said, do not ever tell Tibetans that you are Chinese. And, there was about 10-15 minutes journey left, and he was really scared. And then towards the end, I said, look, Tibetans will be very friendly, particularly you are guests here. And even you say, I'm Chinese, Tibetans will come to you and greet you. And in the afternoon, he came out, and I saw him in Thai and good looking, and I said, look, everything is okay. He said, oh yeah, Tibetan Dharamsala is amazing. People are so friendly. I find so many people speaking in Mandarin, etc. Okay, very good. In the evening, Hotel Tibet, there's a restaurant there. So I happened to be going there with some friends, and he was there with 2 Tibetan ladies. I said, look, Lee, I told you Tibetans are very friendly so long as you live around the Tibetan ladies. This is the misconception that people have. It's misconception created by the Chinese government. They created this assumption that all Tibetans would consider Chinese as enemies. So, very well the Tibetans said, no, Chinese government and Chinese people. His Holiness has made so much effort. In Australia, they have a Chinese liaison. In Washington, D.C., there's a Chinese liaison in the Tibetan office. So he sees it's so important to have this brotherly and sisterly relationship with the Tibetans and Chinese, because he says Tibetans and Chinese have coexisted for thousands of years. Sorry.
Yeah. And can I add something to that?
Quick,
Okay.
we'll open up.
I mean, I do in the book there's a whole chapter about some of the Chinese democracy activists I met in Dharamsala, and then other interactions with Chinese people. And again, it's unexpected, or might be surprising to some people, but for the 50th anniversary of the Tibetan exile, which was a big milestone, the Dalai Lama had on the stage with him at least like a dozen Chinese people who were democracy activists sharing the stage with him on this really momentous day. And they gave speeches. He shared the stage with them. And so I spoke with one of the Chinese democracy activists quite a bit in Hotel Tibet, which is this, seedy bar that people love because I guess the whiskey is cheap, but people love going there. And so we were speaking there, and I got to see him later in Australia. He lives in Australia, and I'll just read a short paragraph about why he is aligned with Tibetans, and I think he and others see their cause as in line with what they want as well. So I said, what could the Federation for a Democratic China do for Tibet? That's the organization he's part of. And he said, we are here to give Tibetans our support. We want to form a coalition in Europe that could give inspiration to people. We want people inside China to fight for their rights, to fight for democracy. Freedom of Tibet is part of our movement. Democracy means everyone has freedom to think, speak, move around, and choose their government. So free Tibet, we should treat them equally, invite them to keep their own language, culture, and religion. Tibetans and His Holiness do not claim for independence. They just want meaningful autonomy. Chinese people should not be brainwashed. Chinese people should open their eyes and ears to see the truth. And also just want to add, I'm sure you know, and Sophie can talk a lot about this too, but Han Chinese people are also persecuted. It may not be for cultural identity, but just any kind of defiance of the government in any way. I mean, we've seen too many Chinese people also being detained, and that could be just from, protesting the COVID lockdowns to, now we see in Hong Kong people being arrested, people like very high-profile business leaders. You would never would have thought that that the Chinese government would do that, because, you have these like multi-millionaire businessmen being arrested now for over 3 years. Chinese, the Falun Gong, it's a spiritual group. I mean, those members are often arrested or disappeared. Christian churches in China are surveyed. So,
Uyghur Muslims now.
Of course, Uyghur Muslims, and this goes back to, some of the questions about claiming independence, claiming for independence. But there, 1 million Uyghurs who are detained in China, or I don't think detained is the right word, incarcerated in camps.
Yes.
So 1 million, I never would have imagined that could happen. So yeah, there's a jump in time in one of the chapters of the 50th anniversary. I'm talking to a journalist who's from China. He's Chinese from China, and he's basically denying that there were about 6,500 Tibetans that could have been arrested at the time. And he said, where would we put all of them, right? And then I had to jump forward in time to, what's going on with the Uyghurs now. So never would have imagined that 1 million Uyghurs who are a Muslim minority in China would be incarcerated.
All right, now we are going to turn to you, the very patient audience. Thank you, and we have a few minutes left, so I will take the round of questions and then throw it back for answers. So, questions?
Mia from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, the microphone is. Please, just your name and then brief, direct question.
Mia, I live in Washington, D.C. and have been involved with the Tibetans since 1972. I'm wondering, Ms. Yee, if you, when I was originally involved in New York City, and I spoke to some of my Chinese non-Tibetan friends, not government in those days, we talked about, what had happened to the Tibetans in 1959, and of course brought up John Avedon's wonderful book, An Exile from the Land of the Snows, which if anybody hasn't read, they should. Yeah, right. And they refused to believe what had happened. I'm wondering if you must have Chinese people friends now. How do they feel about you writing this book, and do they believe what you're saying?
The Chinese people you talked to refused to believe.
Yes, absolutely. They said, no, this never happened, and Tibet was always part of China. And I mean, they basically, they drank the Kool-Aid, and it was impossible to.
Yeah.
And at some point, I got older and sort of had to let other younger people get involved.
Yeah.
Let me take another one, and then you will answer them. Any other question on the floor? Any question online?
This gentleman.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Sorry.
So from online, just Amy, if there are any stories that stick out in your head that didn't make the cut for the book, if there's maybe just one that you could share with us today that maybe we wouldn't be able to find in the text.
Come back to that.
Okay, online, and then we will.
Okay.
Colin Warren from Washington. I got to know Amy while I was living in Delhi. The Indian government has been very, let's say, liberal with allowing the Tibetans to live their life there. Is there a danger with the current government that this could change, and is that any part of any contingency plan of the Tibetans?
All right, those are great questions. Now we have a few minutes left before we close. So 3 questions, I think 2 are directed to Amy and 1 is floating around. You can take it from there. So while you are answering the question, be also prepared for your
Other ones.
30-second closing
Yeah.
remark.
Okay.
All right, so
The
go.
question about the reaction from Chinese people, I'm sure there are people, Chinese from China, who don't believe or who say they don't believe it. Personally, I haven't had anyone argue with me about that. And in fact, many of the people I know, maybe it's because I know them, there's some understanding about this. And I have to say, just very briefly, I taught English in China, mainland China, Nanjing, right after college. And I did not know you're not supposed to talk about controversial topics in your English conversation classes. So I used a copy of my colleague could get Newsweek magazine sent from her parents in the US. And that was when the movie 7 Years in Tibet came out with Brad Pitt. And so I just used that as a, conversation topic in the class. And my students, who I know really well, and we know each other, they didn't know. They didn't know that this is how most of the world sees the Tibet issue and China and Tibet. And they said, quite innocently, we thought we helped Tibetans. That's what they're taught, that, China liberated Tibet. So they didn't know, they weren't defensive or angry, but they were my students and we knew each other really well. So we had a conversation about it, and so they were genuinely surprised. And yeah, I don't know if you...
And the question about anything that did not make it to the book?
Let me save that one,
Okay.
because I'll think about one.
We
There are so many, that's
We
why.
have 7 minutes left, so 1 minute each, and then we will have the closing remark.
But about the India question, and you might want to chime in, because I don't know the current situation under the current administration, Modi. And yes, you're right that the host country has given a lot of support to Tibetan exiles. I mean, entire settlements of swaths of lands across many states in India are allocated to Tibetans. I don't exactly know why. I mean, I think Nehru and the Dalai Lama had a good relationship for to start with, and then Khalden, you might have more to say, or Sophie. And then under the current government, I don't know if there's any retraction of support.
Karen, you want to go?
It's not really I don't really think that that's one of the focal points under the current Indian government of.
As far as any government, the India is a very multifaceted, democratic, complicated, but very stable democracy. I will not touch, whether there's more democracy and freedom press in India now than before. That's a tricky question here for me to mandate. But as a Tibetan, what I can say here is that Tibet matters to India a lot. For example, the biggest issue between India and China is about the border, what they call is Arunachal Pradesh, the line of control there. If you look back into the history, the signatory of that border was between Tibet and China, Tibet and India. British government in, the ruling India and Tibet. China was not participatory in that signature. So, good or bad, Tibet had created this huge chunk of problem for India and China. Historically, there was no China and India border until 1959. There was no war in the history of that Asia, but that part of Asia between India and China, because Tibet was a huge, the entire size of Tibet is size of whole Western Europe, 4 times the Western Europe. So therefore, there's no reason to be worried. The first war was 1962, right? So, and the Dalai Lama having an exile, of course, Indian government, in terms of resources for they spend for the Tibetan. Amy was earlier telling about the Tibetan schools. Without the resources and help from Indian government, it's impossible. Without the help of the land resources that Tibetan can set up the monasteries and schools from the Indian government, federal government as well as the state government, would have been impossible. So what will happen after His Holiness is no longer, it's difficult. But I think geopolitically, it serves the Indian government to, for their advantage in a sense, geopolitically, having His Holiness there, having the Tibetans there. Cultural side, I tell you this is very, very important. Tibetan Buddhist culture is predominantly what is called the Nalanda tradition, came from India and to Tibet from the 6th, 7th centuries onwards until now. So who preserved this? Tibetans. India, it's lost. So there's a cultural, Indian cultural, the revival by the Tibetans in Tibet. So I don't think because of the political situation in India itself would really have too much of an effect on the Tibetan refugees. And besides, if you see the recent stories of the political developments in terms of relationship between India and China, the relationship is getting sour. Why? India is gaining more confidence because their economy is getting better. China is having a lot of problems to deal with. Internally, China is apparently the
Sorry,
country-
Carl,
Sure.
cut you there. We have 3 minutes, and then we'll cut you off. So I want you to put your key point let's start with Sophie, who has not responded to that, but add your key takeaway as related to U.S. foreign policy, to Tibetan issue, and China.
And
So-
I did want to ask Sophie, and maybe we can talk later, but if this is part of your answer, like what, I mean, you're the human rights expert, so what is the outlook? Is there any movement, or what can we?
Yeah, I think the outlook inside the country is fairly bleak at the moment. But if I can try to tie a couple of threads together and offer up a more positive wrap here, I think there's nothing so extraordinary in challenging a repressive regime that seeks to tell different communities that they don't have anything in common, than those communities not only finding common purpose, but in standing up for one another. And so, for example, in the 90s and the aughts, when we started to see, for example, East Coast human rights lawyers defending Uyghurs and Tibetans in court. Yeah. And when you look at the landscape of activist groups in communities all over the world and how much work is now being done collaboratively yes. by very different groups, all of whom have in common having been persecuted in some way by the Chinese government, I think that's an extraordinary form of resistance. And maybe if Amy is taking requests for the next book, it will be about how some of these communities have come together in exile to make use of their democratic rights to challenge Beijing.
Yes.
I think that's a remarkable story that's yet to be written,
Yep.
and I would love to read you writing on that.
I think that's for you, Sophie.
Yes.
Maybe we'll do it together.
Amy, Keldon, one final thought for you, and then Amy will have the final. 10 seconds.
I will 10 seconds, very quickly. Amy's book, Roof of the World, our meeting was very accidental. But from that, what it shows is a journey. These books describe so well into the shifting dynamism of Tibetan people, particularly Tibetans in exile, how they struggle and juggle between the survival, giving a life they didn't have for their generation, also how they preserve the Tibetan identity and culture in a very unknown world. My kids, grew up here, born here and grew up here in the United States. We have had the same struggle, but try to maintain that continuation of Tibetan culture and identity passed along this generation. So, Amy's book shows the struggle, the vibrancy, the resistance, so it's amazing. So I would encourage everyone to go and get a copy, because this is a very different set of, different book, really.
And Amy, congratulations. Now you have the final thought on the book, but there is a very good metaphor you described there, that you were trying to strike a balance between journalistic objectivity and sometimes you be a fly on the wall, but sometimes you became a fly in the soup. Maybe you can add something about that.
Okay,
but,
well, this is a lot to say in 30 seconds. So the fly in the soup, I was specifically, there are many moments, but specifically thinking about when Deki asked me to help her get her money from, she and her husband and a group of Tibetans had worked at a call center in India doing calls in Mandarin, and they were never paid. And they asked me to help them get their money. And I at first was like, what can I do? But just to give you a spoiler, I got the money. We got the money. Yep. So that chapter, it's called Money Matters, and it's verbatim dialogue between myself and the lawyer that the call center manager got, and me, and yeah, it was not expected, but that's just what happened.
The humanity aspect of it, yes.
Yeah, and then I guess one of my final thoughts is that sometimes people have said, oh, your book is about refugees, it must be depressing, and while there's definitely sadness and tragedy and things that are unpleasant. However, I think it's inspiring, and so that's what kept me going for so long. Really inspired by the people I met and their stories. Should I give one final thought about something that was not in the book?
Go.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so this is just a travel story, and it's not in the book. So the book is also a travel log. So this book went through peer review, academic peer review, and one of the academic peer reviewers said, this reads like a travel book, and I was like, it is a travel book. That's why it's in the subtitle, just to be clear. But one thing that happened, I was taking a bus between Delhi and Dharamsala a lot. It's a 12-hour overnight bus that goes up and down these winding mountain roads. I get car sick in a taxi across Manhattan, so it was, physically difficult. But the halfway point is in a city called Dehradun, and I never got off the bus normally. It's the middle of the night, it's 3 or 4 in the morning. One time I decided to get off the bus and go to the bathroom, which I normally don't do. When I came back from the bathroom, the bus was not there, and my laptop was in the bus, because I stupidly at 3 or 4 in the morning did not take it with me. Laptop with all my notebooks and my notes from all my interviews. So I was running around Dehradun bus station at 4 in the morning, like having panic attacks. And actually, Indian people were trying to help me. And that's very common, actually. People were trying to help me find the next bus to Delhi, and I was like, my laptop won't be there when I arrive. And then suddenly I looked up in the bus, I could see the bus coming back, and it had turned around. Someone on the bus saw that I wasn't in my seat and told the driver to turn around and come back to get me. So I got all my notes in my laptop.
That is that is a great way to end this. And the book is Far From the Rooftop of the World, and we have copies out there. Please, if you can help yourself with it and buy one, and then we can sign. Proceeds of this will go to some of the charity organizations mentioned in the book to help these people and the animals in India. Mm-hmm. As someone who went through similar experience as characters described in the book, I really commend Amy for what she did, following these individuals and humanize the labels, the statistics, and that's what this event is about, humanizing the labels you often hear, the refugee, the displaced, the numbers keep rising. There are real people behind those numbers. They are our fellow human beings, our friends, grandma, and they have stories. And I think we gotta relate to them and try to change things for the better, so that no one can just go through those. That is it. Thank you very much for to our online audience, you, and let's clap to our speakers. Congratulations.
Thank you, John Thom. Thank you to our speakers.